There is a quiet truth most people never hear about books. Reading them does not automatically change your life. You can finish dozens, highlight passages, quote lines, and still react the same way under pressure. You can know the right ideas and still repeat the same habits, the same fears, the same emotional patterns. That does not mean you are weak or incapable. It only means that knowledge alone is not transformation. I learned this the uncomfortable way. For a long time, I thought I was growing because I was reading. I felt smarter, more aware, more informed. But when life tested me, nothing was different. I still rushed decisions. I still avoided difficult conversations. I still let stress dictate my behavior. The words stayed in my head, but they never reached my actions, and that gap slowly became impossible to ignore. Everything shifted when I stopped reading to feel inspired and started reading to be challenged. I slowed down. I chose fewer books. I paid attention to the ideas that irritated me, the ones that questioned how I saw myself. Instead of asking whether a book was interesting, I asked whether it demanded something from me. Some pages took days to move past, not because they were complex, but because they forced me to confront habits I had protected for years. I saw similar changes in people close to me. A friend who once reacted to everything learned to pause before responding. A colleague who constantly sought approval became comfortable saying no. A family member who felt lost gained direction without making noise about it. None of them changed overnight. They simply allowed certain ideas to sink in deeply enough to shape their decisions. When that happens, a book stops being information and becomes identity. What makes this process powerful is how subtle it feels from the inside. There is no dramatic moment where everything clicks at once. Instead, you notice that you respond differently without trying. You speak with more restraint. You feel less urgency to prove yourself. You tolerate discomfort without immediately escaping it. These small shifts are easy to miss, but over time they reshape the direction of your life. Many people are waiting for confidence before they act, or certainty before they commit. But absorbed ideas work in reverse. They change how you see yourself first, and action follows naturally, without force, without noise, and without constant internal resistance. If you are listening to this, there is a chance you recognize yourself here. You might feel aware but unsettled, motivated but inconsistent, capable yet stuck. You sense that something inside you wants to shift, but you have not found the leverage point. That does not mean you need more motivation or more discipline. Sometimes you need a different way of absorbing what you already consume. This video is not about collecting titles or memorizing lessons. It is about how certain books, when truly absorbed, restructure the way you think. They change how you interpret events, how you handle emotion, how you see yourself in moments of pressure. Once that shift happens, your old patterns no longer fit, and returning to who you were becomes impossible today. If these words resonate with you, share this video with a friend you know is searching for clarity and strength, and who needs this perspective to improve their life. Chapter 1. The First Shift. You stop seeing yourself as a victim. The first real shift happens long before confidence appears, long before discipline becomes natural, and long before life visibly improves. It begins the moment you stop telling yourself a comforting story about why things are the way they are. This shift is quiet, uncomfortable, and deeply personal. It is the moment you stop seeing yourself as a victim of circumstances and start recognizing yourself as the common factor in your own life. Before this shift, life feels reactive. Events seem to arrive without permission. Other people's moods affect your inner state. External pressure determines your behavior. When something goes wrong, your mind searches outward for explanations. The timing was bad. People were unfair. Conditions were not ideal. None of these thoughts are lies, but they quietly remove your sense of agency. Over time, they create a subtle helplessness that no amount of motivation can fix. I lived inside that mindset longer than I realized. I thought I was self-aware because I could analyze my problems clearly. I understood my patterns. I could explain why I felt stuck, but explanation had replaced responsibility. I had learned how to narrate my struggles instead of changing my responses. The more insight I gathered, the more convincing my excuses became. The books that truly change you do not comfort this mindset. They dismantle it. They introduce a difficult idea that initially feels unfair. You are responsible for your internal state, even when you are not responsible for the situation itself. This distinction is heavy. It does not deny hardship. It removes your permission to remain passive. I remember the resistance I felt the first time I encountered this idea. It sounded harsh, almost cold. I wanted to argue with him. I wanted exceptions, but the idea stayed with me because it explained something nothing else had. Why knowledge alone never translated into change. Why understanding did not lead to control. I'd been waiting for circumstances to improve before I improved my response. I saw this shift clearly in someone close to me. A friend who constantly felt unlucky, always had a detailed explanation for why things stalled. Work environments were toxic. People were unreliable. Opportunities were scarce. After absorbing this principle, something subtle changed. He stopped describing his life and started examining his choices. He began asking uncomfortable questions. What am I tolerating that I should not? What patterns am I repeating? What am I avoiding taking responsibility for? His situation did not change immediately, but his posture toward it did. This is the first real transformation absorbed in books. You stop waiting for life to cooperate before you act differently. You stop needing perfect conditions to feel stable. Instead of asking why this is happening to you, you ask how you will respond. That question alone restores agency. You may not control events, but you control your interpretation and your next action. This shift often feels unsettling because victimhood, while painful, is familiar. It provides identity. Letting it go means letting go of stories that once protected your self-image. It means accepting that improvement requires discomfort and accountability. But it also frees enormous energy that was previously trapped in blame, resentment, and comparison. Once this idea begins to settle, your internal dialogue changes. You complain less, not because you suppress yourself, but because complaining no longer serves you. You notice emotional reactions sooner. You recover faster from setbacks. You begin to respect yourself more because you trust your ability to respond instead of react. For the listener, this shift begins with awareness rather than force. Notice moments where your mind automatically frames you as powerless. Listen for familiar phrases that remove responsibility. You do not need to judge them. You only need to see them. Awareness weakens old patterns faster than self-criticism ever could. Absorbing responsibility does not make you harsh or rigid. It makes you grounded. You still feel disappointment, anger, and frustration, but these emotions no longer dictate your behavior. You become someone who can experience emotion without surrendering direction. That capacity becomes the foundation for everything that follows. Many people confuse responsibility with self-blame, and that confusion keeps them stuck. Blame looks backward and drains energy. Responsibility looks forward and creates momentum. It asks one simple question: what is the next controlled action available to me right now? When this becomes your default response, progress accelerates quietly. I remember a moment when this distinction became real for me. A recurring situation appeared again, one I had complained about for years. The environment had not changed. The people had not changed. For the first time, I did not analyze or explain. I adjusted my behavior. That single adjustment broke a pattern that had lasted far longer than I realized. Nothing dramatic happened externally, but internally, something locked into place. This is how absorption works. It is not loud. It is structural. Once an idea reshapes how you interpret events, it influences countless small decisions automatically. You do not wake up thinking about it every day. You simply act differently. That is why this first shift matters so much. Without it, every other lesson remains theoretical. As this responsibility settles in, a quiet confidence begins to emerge. Not confidence built on success or validation, but confidence built on self-trust. You know that no matter what appears, you will respond deliberately. That knowledge stabilizes you. It becomes the ground beneath every decision you make next. This is where real change begins. Not with inspiration, not with intensity, but with ownership. When you fully absorb this shift, your mind moves from reaction to intention, from helplessness to quiet strength. And once that movement begins, there is no return to the person you were before. Chapter 2. When your emotional reactions begin to slow down. The second shift does not announce itself. There is no dramatic realization, no sudden calm that feels permanent. Instead, it shows up in small, almost forgettable moments. A comment that would normally irritate you still registers, but your body does not rush to respond. A stressful situation still creates tension, but it no longer hijacks your behavior. Something inside you creates space, and that space becomes the most powerful change you experience. Before this shift, emotions feel immediate and demanding. When anger appears, it wants expression. When anxiety arises, it wants action. When insecurity surfaces, it wants reassurance. Most people live at the mercy of this urgency. They believe that feeling something means they must do something about it right now. Over time, this creates a life filled with impulsive decisions, unnecessary conflict, and constant emotional exhaustion. The books that slow your reactions do not teach you to suppress emotions. Suppression only creates pressure that eventually explodes. Instead, these books teach a different relationship with emotion. They show you that emotion is a signal, not a command. You can feel fully without obeying immediately. Absorbing this idea takes repetition because it challenges years of conditioning. I remember the first time this lesson showed up in real life. A conversation turned tense, and I felt the familiar urge to defend myself. My chest tightened, my thoughts accelerated, and words lined up ready to be released. But instead of speaking, I paused. Not deliberately, not heroically, but because something inside me no longer rushed. The urge passed. When I finally spoke, my words were slower and clearer. The situation softened. I realized afterward that nothing external had changed. I had. That pause becomes a form of quiet authority. When you stop reacting immediately, you stop giving your emotional leverage away. People who provoke rely on speed. They rely on pulling you into their rhythm. When you slow down, you break that rhythm. You remain centered while others reveal their impatience. I saw this clearly in a colleague who used to be reactive under pressure. Meetings would escalate quickly, and he often felt misunderstood. After internalizing this principle, his behavior shifted. He listened longer, he answered later. Sometimes he said nothing at all. Instead of weakening his position, this restraint strengthened it. Others began choosing their words more carefully around him. His calm changed the temperature of the room. This is one of the least understood aspects of emotional mastery. Calm does not mean passive. Calm is controlled energy. It is the ability to hold intensity without leaking it into unnecessary action. When you absorb this lesson deeply, you begin to experience emotions fully while maintaining direction. Internally, this shift feels like relief. Your nervous system begins to trust that you're not going to panic at every signal. Emotional spikes still occur, but they peak lower and fade faster. You stop replaying arguments in your mind. You stop carrying tension long after situations end. Mental space opens up where rumination used to live. Many people fear that slowing down emotionally will make them less authentic. They believe that immediate expression equals honesty. In reality, delayed response often produces greater truth. When you pause, you separate raw emotion from considered intention. What remains is more aligned with who you actually want to be, not who your nervous system temporarily demands you become. To begin absorbing this shift, start by noticing your first impulse without judging it. Let it exist without acting. This alone weakens its grip. Ask yourself whether responding now improves the outcome or only relieves momentary discomfort. Often, silence is the stronger choice. Over time, this practice changes how you carry yourself. Your posture softens. Your voice steadies. You stop rushing to explain or justify. People sense that you are not easily shaken. They may not understand why, but they feel it. I noticed this change in myself during moments that once drained me. Difficult conversations became shorter. Conflict felt less personal. Even criticism lost its sting. I no longer needed to defend my identity through reaction. My sense of self became quieter, and in that quiet, it grew stronger. This shift also affects decision-making. When emotions slow down, clarity increases. You see options more clearly. You choose actions based on long-term alignment rather than short-term relief. Regret decreases, not because you avoid mistakes, but because your choices reflect intention rather than impulse. Books that cultivate this shift often emphasize observation over reaction. They encourage you to witness your internal state as it arises, without interference. At first, this feels unnatural. With time, it becomes instinctive. You begin to experience life with a slight delay, just enough to remain grounded. Eventually, others begin to notice. They comment that you seem calmer, more composed, harder to provoke. They may assume you are detached. In truth, you are more present than ever. Presence does not mean reacting to everything. It means choosing where your attention and energy belong. This second shift prepares you for deeper transformation. Without emotional restraint, responsibility collapses under pressure. With it, you can hold discomfort without abandoning your values. You become someone who does not need to win every moment because you are building something larger. When this lesson is fully absorbed, emotional storms lose their power to steer you. You still feel anger, fear, and excitement, but they no longer decide your direction. You decide. That decision happens quietly, repeatedly, and without applause. Over time, it changes the trajectory of your life in ways no burst of motivation ever could. This is how absorbed books work. They do not excite you into action, they stabilize you into consistency, and consistency, grounded in emotional control, becomes the foundation of unshakable strength. Chapter 3. You become harder to manipulate. The third shift begins the moment you realize how often your behavior has been guided by pressure you never consciously agreed to. Not force, not commands, pressure, emotional cues, urgency, expectations, and unspoken demands. Once you see this clearly, something inside you stops cooperating automatically. You do not become cold or resistant. You become deliberate, and that is when manipulation starts losing its power over you. Before this shift, most people believe they are acting freely. They say yes because it feels polite. They explain themselves because it feels reasonable. They rush decisions because the moment feels important. Rarely does it feel like manipulation. It feels like being a good person. Over time, however, this pattern trains you to move according to other people's emotional states rather than your own values. I used to live in that pattern without questioning it. If someone sounded disappointed, I felt responsible. If a situation felt tense, I felt compelled to fix it. If silence appeared, I rushed to fill it. I told myself I was being considerate. In reality, I was being reactive. My actions were shaped by discomfort, not intention. The books that initiate this shift do not make you suspicious of others. They make you honest with yourself. They reveal a simple truth. Manipulation only works when it connects to an unresolved need inside you. The need to be liked, the need to avoid conflict, the need to feel necessary. When those needs weaken, manipulation loses its entry point. I remember a recurring situation with someone close to me who communicated dissatisfaction indirectly. There were no clear requests, only moods. In the past, I would rush to smooth things over, trying to anticipate what was wrong. After absorbing this lesson, I did something unfamiliar. I stayed present, calm, and silent. I did not respond to the emotional atmosphere. Eventually, the other person had to speak directly. The dynamic shifted without confrontation. For the first time, clarity replaced tension. This is the essence of becoming harder to manipulate. You stop reacting to implication and start responding to clarity. Manipulation thrives on ambiguity and speed. When you slow down and require directness, it often dissolves on its own. I saw the same change in a friend who constantly felt overwhelmed by other people's expectations. He carried invisible obligations everywhere he went. After internalizing this principle, he began pausing before agreeing to anything. He stopped justifying his choices. When someone expressed disappointment, he allowed it to exist without trying to erase it. At first, this felt uncomfortable. Then it felt liberating. The pressure lifted. His energy returned. This shift also transforms how you consume information. You stop reacting emotionally to headlines, opinions, and narratives designed to provoke urgency. You notice when something is trying to move you emotionally rather than inform you. This awareness creates mental independence. You can listen without absorbing anxiety. You can disagree without engaging in conflict. At the core of this transformation is a difficult but freeing realization. Not every emotion directed at you is your responsibility. Someone else's discomfort does not automatically require your action. Someone else's urgency does not automatically dictate your pace. This realization often feels wrong at first, especially if you have built your identity around being helpful or accommodating. But it is not wrong. It is boundary awareness. As this idea settles in, your internal dialogue changes. Instead of asking, "How do I keep this smooth?" you ask, "What response aligns with my principles and long-term stability?" That question introduces choice. Where there was once an automatic reaction, there is now space. You also begin to notice when you manipulate yourself. You catch the internal stories that rush you into action. The fear that silence will damage relationships. The belief that saying no makes you selfish. The urge to explain to avoid being misunderstood. Seeing these patterns weakens them. You stop being rushed by your own narratives. This shift affects how you carry yourself. Your posture becomes more relaxed. Your tone becomes simpler. You stop adding emotional padding to your words. People sense that you're not easily swayed. They may not consciously understand why, but they respond differently. Conversations slow down. Expectations become clearer. Importantly, becoming harder to manipulate does not mean becoming rigid or uncooperative. You still listen. You still adapt. The difference is that your adjustments are chosen rather than coerced. You cooperate without surrendering yourself. This balance builds respect, both internal and external. For the listener, applying this shift begins with observation. Notice moments when urgency appears without clarity. Notice when emotions are used instead of direct communication. You do not need to confront these moments aggressively. Often, calm presence and a request for precision are enough to reset the interaction. As this principle deepens, your life simplifies. You carry fewer invisible obligations. You feel less drained after social interactions. Your decisions begin to reflect your priorities rather than other people's expectations. This creates a quiet sense of freedom that no external validation can replace. Books that cultivate this shift often frame boundaries not as walls, but as definitions. Boundaries clarify where you end and others begin. When boundaries are clear, manipulation struggles to find space. You no longer need to defend yourself constantly because you are no longer porous. Eventually, you realize something profound. Manipulation loses power not when you outsmart it, but when you no longer need approval, reassurance, or control from others. That lack of need is not arrogance, it is self-sufficiency. This third shift builds directly on the earlier ones. Responsibility gives you ownership. Emotional restraint gives you pause. Together, they create discernment. You begin to see situations as they are, not as they are framed to move you. When this lesson is fully absorbed, you move through the world with steadiness. You are open, but not exposed. Engaged, but not entangled. Responsive, but not reactive. That balance protects your energy and sharpens your judgment. This is how certain books permanently change your mind. They do not give you tricks or tactics. They change what you notice. And once you see these dynamics clearly, you cannot unsee them. You are no longer available to be pulled where you did not consciously choose to go. Chapter 4. Your definition of success quietly changes. The fourth shift is one of the most surprising because it happens without effort and without announcement. You do not wake up one day deciding to redefine success. It simply stops feeling the way it used to. The goals that once excited you begin to feel hollow. The standards you borrowed from others lose their authority. And in that quiet space, something more grounded starts to form. Before this shift, success often feels loud. It is measured in visibility, recognition, speed, and comparison. You look outward to evaluate your progress. You track how far ahead or behind you are relative to others. Even when you achieve something, the satisfaction fades quickly, replaced by a new benchmark you feel pressured to reach. Many people live their entire lives inside this loop, constantly striving but rarely settled. I was deeply familiar with that pattern. There was a time when achievement felt urgent, almost anxious. Each milestone brought temporary relief, followed by a subtle emptiness. I told myself this was ambition, that discomfort meant growth. But something felt off. The pressure never lifted. It only shifted targets. The books that reshape your definition of success do not reject achievement. They strip it of illusion. They expose how much of what we chase is driven by external validation rather than internal alignment. Absorbing this idea is uncomfortable at first because it forces you to question goals you have invested years into pursuing. I noticed this shift clearly in someone close to me who had built their identity around being seen as successful. Their schedule was full, their achievements visible, yet they were constantly restless. After absorbing this principle, they began making quieter choices. They declined opportunities that looked impressive, but felt misaligned. At first, this felt like a loss. Over time, it felt like relief. This is the moment success stops being about accumulation and starts being about coherence. You care less about how things look and more about how they feel internally. Progress becomes something you sense rather than display. You begin measuring your life by stability, clarity, and consistency instead of applause. This shift also changes how you respond to other people's achievements. Comparison loses its edge. You can appreciate others without feeling diminished. Their path no longer threatens yours because you are no longer racing toward the same finish line. This creates emotional freedom that many people never experience. Internally, the pressure to perform relaxes. You still work hard, but the work feels chosen rather than forced. You are no longer driven by fear of falling behind. Instead, you are guided by a clearer understanding of what matters to you. This clarity becomes a filter that simplifies decisions. I remember realizing this shift during a moment that once would have felt like failure. An opportunity passed me by, one I would have chased aggressively in the past. Instead of regret, I felt calm. I knew that accepting it would have disrupted something more important, my rhythm. That realization would have been impossible earlier. It emerged naturally once my definition of success had changed. This new definition is quieter, but stronger. Success becomes the ability to move through life without constant internal conflict. It is waking up without dread. It is trusting your direction even when it is not validated externally. It is having enough self-respect to say no to what drains you, even if it impresses others. For many listeners, this shift may feel unsettling. Letting go of traditional markers of success can feel like losing identity, but what you gain is far more stable. You gain alignment, and alignment sustains effort far better than pressure ever could. As this idea settles in, your goals evolve. They become fewer but deeper. You stop scattering energy across multiple pursuits. Focus replaces frenzy. Progress becomes steady instead of dramatic. This often looks like slowing down from the outside, but internally it feels like acceleration. This shift also affects how you handle setbacks. When success is externally defined, failure feels personal and destabilizing. When success is internally defined, setbacks become information rather than judgment. You adjust without collapsing. Resilience grows quietly. Books that facilitate this shift often emphasize values over outcomes. They ask questions that do not have immediate answers. What kind of person do you want to be under pressure? What pace allows you to stay consistent? What compromises cost you more than they give? Sitting with these questions changes your orientation over time. You begin to notice that peace becomes a metric, not comfort, but steadiness, the ability to remain grounded even when things are uncertain. This steadiness becomes addictive in the best way. You protect it, you choose accordingly. Others may not understand this change. Some may assume you have lost ambition. In reality, your ambition has matured. It is no longer reactive. It is directed. You are no longer chasing success. You are building a life that can support it. This fourth shift is crucial because it prevents burnout. Without it, discipline eventually collapses under the weight of external expectation. With it, discipline feels sustainable. You are working towards something that fits you, not something you borrowed. When this lesson is fully absorbed, success stops feeling like a finish line and starts feeling like a way of moving. Each day becomes an opportunity to act in alignment rather than impress. Over time, this creates a sense of fulfillment that is difficult to describe, but easy to recognize. This is how absorbed books reshape your life at a deeper level. They do not tell you what to want. They help you see why you want what you want. And when that understanding changes, your entire direction follows quietly, steadily, and without the need for constant validation. Chapter 5. Discipline stops feeling like punishment. The fifth shift is where many people are surprised by themselves. Discipline, which once felt heavy and restrictive, begins to feel grounding. What used to require force now feels natural. You no longer need to motivate yourself the same way because you are no longer fighting against your own resistance. Something inside you has aligned. Before this shift, discipline is often misunderstood as self-control through pressure. You push yourself when you feel guilty. You try to maintain routines through willpower. When you fail, you criticize yourself and promise to try harder next time. This cycle creates an adversarial relationship with yourself. Discipline becomes something you endure rather than something you choose. I lived in that tension for years. Every attempt to become more consistent felt like a battle. Some days I won, many days I lost. When I failed, I assumed I lacked character. I told myself I needed more motivation, more intensity, more urgency. None of it worked for long. The harder I pushed, the more resistance I felt. The books that truly reshape discipline do not glorify force. They redefine discipline as self-respect. This reframing changes everything. Discipline is no longer about denying yourself. It is about honoring commitments you made when you were clear. When this idea is absorbed, discipline stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like alignment. I saw this shift clearly in a family member who struggled with consistency for years. They would start routines with enthusiasm, only to abandon them weeks later. After internalizing this principle, they changed their approach. Instead of asking how much they could do, they asked what they could sustain. They lowered the bar, but raised the standard of consistency. The result was quiet, but powerful. Weeks turned into months. Confidence grew without effort. This is the core realization. Discipline is easier when it is connected to identity rather than outcome. When you act because it reflects who you are, not because of what you hope to get, resistance decreases. You are no longer negotiating with yourself every day. The decision has already been made. Internally, this shift feels like relief. You stop oscillating between intensity and burnout. You no longer need dramatic motivation to begin. Small actions feel sufficient. Progress becomes steady rather than explosive. This steadiness builds trust with yourself, which is the real fuel behind discipline. I noticed this change in myself when I stopped asking whether I felt like doing something. That question had always been a trap. Feelings fluctuate. Instead, I began asking whether the action aligned with the kind of person I wanted to be. The answer was often clear. When action followed identity, effort felt lighter. Discipline also becomes quieter. You stop announcing your routines. You stop seeking validation for consistency. The work becomes private, almost invisible. This privacy strengthens it. You're no longer performing discipline for others. You're practicing it for yourself. This shift also changes how you handle missed days. Before, missing a day would trigger guilt and abandonment. Now it triggers adjustment. You return without drama. You understand that consistency is not perfection. It is resilience. One missed action does not erase identity. For the listener, absorbing this lesson begins with redefining discipline internally. Ask yourself what commitments represent self-respect rather than self-punishment. Start small enough that consistency feels inevitable. Let repetition, not intensity, build momentum. Over time, discipline becomes something you rely on rather than resist. It provides structure in moments of uncertainty. It grounds you when motivation fades. This grounding creates emotional stability because you know you can trust your behavior even when feelings fluctuate. Books that instill this shift often emphasize process over results. They encourage showing up even when nothing exciting happens. They remind you that progress is rarely visible at the moment. Absorbing this truth reduces impatience. You stop rushing outcomes. You focus on execution. This shift also affects your self-image. You begin to see yourself as someone who follows through. That perception changes how you approach challenges. You no longer doubt your ability to stay consistent. You have evidence. That evidence is built quietly, one small action at a time. Others may not notice this change immediately. Discipline expressed without drama rarely attracts attention, but its effects compound. Opportunities appear because you are reliable. Trust increases because you are consistent. Confidence grows because you keep your word to yourself. The most powerful aspect of this shift is how it reduces internal friction. Life becomes simpler when you're not constantly negotiating with yourself. Decisions feel lighter. Energy is conserved. You're no longer exhausted by self-conflict. I remember realizing this shift during a period that would have overwhelmed me in the past. Responsibilities stacked up. Pressure increased. Instead of collapsing or forcing myself, I relied on routine. The structure held me steady. I did not feel heroic. I felt stable. That stability was new, and it lasted. This is what absorbed books do differently. They do not hype discipline. They normalize it. They show you that discipline is not about becoming someone else. It is about becoming more consistent with who you already are when you are clear. When this lesson fully settles, discipline becomes a form of self-care. It protects your future self from chaos. It creates predictability in an unpredictable world. You no longer chase motivation. You move with intention. This fifth shift is where many people finally stop fighting themselves. They realize that discipline is not an enemy to overcome, but a relationship to repair. When that relationship is healed, progress stops feeling forced. It becomes natural, sustainable, and quietly powerful. Chapter 6. You speak less, but with more weight. The sixth shift is often noticed by others before you become fully aware of it yourself. Conversations begin to feel different. You are no longer rushing to fill the silence. You stop explaining things that do not need explanation. Your words become fewer, but they land with more force. Without trying to sound authoritative, you begin to be taken more seriously. Before this shift, many people use words as a form of protection. They talk to ease tension, to prove competence, to avoid misunderstanding, or to gain approval. Silence feels dangerous. It feels like giving up control. As a result, conversations become crowded with unnecessary detail, emotional padding, and justifications. The more uncertain someone feels internally, the more they tend to speak. I was deeply familiar with this pattern. I believed that clarity came from saying more. If I could just explain myself better, people would understand. If I spoke quickly enough, I could stay ahead of doubt. What I did not realize was that over-explaining was revealing insecurity rather than competence. My words were working against me. The books that change how you speak do not teach techniques or scripts. They change how you relate to silence. They help you understand that silence is not emptiness, it is space. And space gives words weight. When you absorb this lesson, you no longer feel pressure to perform verbally. You allow meaning to carry itself. I noticed this shift during a meeting where I normally would have contributed early and often. Instead, I listened. I did not rehearse responses in my head. When I finally spoke, it was brief and direct. The room responded differently. People paused. Questions followed. The impact surprised me. I had said less, but heard more. This is not accidental. When you speak less, people pay closer attention. When your words are not diluted by excess, they stand out. Silence becomes a signal that you are comfortable with yourself. That comfort creates authority. I saw the same transformation in a colleague who had always struggled to command attention. He knew his work, but his delivery undermined him. After internalizing this principle, he stopped filling gaps. He answered questions without elaboration. If clarity was needed, he provided it calmly, without urgency. His presence changed. Others deferred to him naturally. This shift is not about withholding communication. It is about precision. You begin to value accuracy over volume. You choose words that reflect intention rather than emotion. This makes your communication cleaner and more effective. Internally, this change feels grounding. You stop monitoring how you are being perceived while you speak. You stop chasing immediate feedback. You trust that your words, when chosen carefully, will stand on their own. This trust reduces anxiety and increases presence. For many listeners, silence triggers discomfort because it feels like exposure. Absorbing this lesson requires sitting with that discomfort without escaping it. Over time, silence becomes neutral, even supportive. You learn that you do not disappear when you stop talking. You become more visible. This shift also changes how you listen. When you are not preparing to respond constantly, you hear more clearly. You notice tone, intention, and subtext. This deeper listening improves your responses, making them more relevant and impactful. As your words gain weight, your relationships change. Conversations become more deliberate. Arguments lose intensity. You are no longer pulled into verbal battles. You respond when necessary, not reflexively. This restraint often diffuses conflict before it escalates. I noticed this change in personal relationships as well. Situations that once turned into long explanations resolved with a few sentences. Boundaries became easier to express because they were not wrapped in apology. Respect followed naturally. Books that foster this shift often emphasize clarity of thought before clarity of speech. When your thinking is ordered, your words require less effort. You're no longer translating confusion into language. You're expressing understanding. This also affects your inner dialogue. You stop narrating everything internally. Mental noise decreases. Decisions become simpler because you are not debating yourself endlessly. This internal quiet supports external precision. Over time, people begin to associate your words with reliability. When you speak, it matters. When you are silent, it is intentional. This reputation builds without effort. It is the byproduct of consistency and restraint. Importantly, this shift does not make you distant or unapproachable. On the contrary, your presence often becomes more reassuring. People feel that you are steady, attentive, and not reactive. They trust you with important conversations because you do not overwhelm them with noise. For the listener, applying this shift begins with awareness. Notice when you speak to relieve discomfort rather than to add value. Experiment with allowing pauses to exist. Resist the urge to fill them. Observe how others respond. At first, this may feel unnatural. You may worry about being misunderstood. With time, you will see that clarity improves when urgency decreases. Your communication becomes more intentional, less emotional. This sixth shift is closely tied to the previous ones. Responsibility gives you ownership. Emotional restraint gives you pause. Boundaries give you independence. Together, they create a voice that does not need to assert itself. It simply carries weight. When this lesson is fully absorbed, speaking becomes an extension of who you are, not a tool to manage perception. You are no longer trying to sound confident. You are confident in your restraint. This is how absorbed books change communication at its core. They do not teach you what to say. They teach you when to speak. And that understanding transforms your presence in every room you enter, quietly and permanently. Chapter 7. Loneliness no longer scares you. The seventh shift is one of the quietest, yet one of the most liberating. You begin to notice that being alone no longer feels like a problem to solve. Silence no longer creates anxiety. Empty time no longer demands distraction. What once felt uncomfortable now feels neutral, sometimes even grounding. Loneliness loses its power when you stop running from it. Before this shift, many people equate being alone with being behind. If there is no conversation, no notification, no external stimulation, something must be wrong. Solitude feels like absence instead of space. As a result, people fill every gap with noise. Music, scrolling, talking, constant connection. Not because they enjoy it, but because they fear what might surface in the quiet. I used to experience that restlessness clearly. Moments alone felt heavy. I would reach for my phone without thinking, not out of interest, but out of habit. Silence felt like something to escape. What I did not realize was that this constant avoidance was training my mind to depend on external input for stability. The books that change your relationship with loneliness do not encourage isolation. They encourage self-containment. They teach you that solitude is not deprivation. It is a condition where your thoughts can finally organize themselves without interruption. Absorbing this idea takes time because it requires sitting with discomfort long enough for it to dissolve. I remember the first time I stayed alone without reaching for distraction. The initial minutes were uneasy. Thoughts surfaced quickly, unfinished emotions, unresolved questions. My instinct was to escape. Instead, I stayed. Gradually, the intensity softened. The noise settled. What remained was a sense of clarity I had not felt in a long time. I saw this same transformation in a friend who once feared being alone with his thoughts. Social interaction was his shield. After absorbing this lesson, he began taking time for himself intentionally. Walk without headphones, evenings without plans. At first, it felt strange. Over time, it became necessary. His decisions grew clearer, his energy stabilized. He no longer needed constant reassurance from others. This shift is not about rejecting connection. It is about removing dependency. When loneliness no longer scares you, relationships become choices rather than needs. You stop using people to fill internal gaps. This makes your connections healthier and more honest. Internally, this change feels like grounding. You become familiar with your own mental landscape. You recognize recurring thoughts without reacting to them. You become comfortable with pauses. This comfort creates emotional resilience. When external validation disappears, you remain steady. Many people confuse loneliness with solitude. Loneliness is the feeling of lack. Solitude is the presence of self. Absorbing this distinction changes everything. You realize that being alone is not the same as being empty. Often, it is the opposite. This shift also changes how you handle boredom. Instead of seeing it as a problem, you see it as a signal that your mind is recalibrating. Creativity often appears here. Insight emerges when stimulation drops. Books that emphasize stillness help you recognize this pattern. I noticed that my tolerance for noise decreased, not in an irritated way, but in a selective one. I began choosing quieter environments, fewer conversations, but deeper ones, fewer inputs, but more reflection. Life slowed down externally, but internally it felt more intentional. This shift can feel isolating at first. As you become more comfortable alone, you may notice distance from people who thrive on constant stimulation. This is not a loss. It is realignment. Some relationships deepen, others fade naturally. What remains feels cleaner. For the listener, absorbing this lesson begins with creating small pockets of intentional solitude. Not to think harder, but to think less. Sit without input. Walk without distraction. Allow your mind to wander without direction. At first, resistance will appear. That resistance is the habit of avoidance surfacing. Over time, something changes. Silence becomes familiar. You stop checking the time. You stop needing immediate engagement. You begin to trust your own company. This trust is subtle, but it reshapes how you move through the world. Books that cultivate this shift often highlight the importance of inner dialogue. When you are never alone, you never hear yourself clearly. Solitude reveals patterns you are too distracted to notice. Seeing them is not always comfortable, but it is always useful. This shift also strengthens your sense of identity. When you are not constantly influenced by others' moods and opinions, your own values become clearer. You stop adjusting yourself to fit every room. You carry consistency with you. Eventually, loneliness transforms into independence. You enjoy connection without clinging to it. You appreciate company without fearing its absence. This balance creates emotional freedom. I realized this shift fully during a period where external interaction dropped unexpectedly. What once would have felt destabilizing felt manageable. I was not energized by isolation, but I was not drained by it either. I felt anchored. This is what absorbed books offer here. They do not romanticize solitude. They normalize it. They show you that being comfortable alone is not a personality trait. It is a practiced relationship with yourself. When this lesson settles deeply, you stop running from quiet moments. You stop fearing empty spaces. You become someone who can sit with themselves without urgency. That ability changes everything. It strengthens decision-making, emotional stability, and self-trust. This seventh shift prepares you for the final transformation. When loneliness no longer scares you, you're no longer dependent on external conditions for stability. You carry your center with you. And from that center, you can move through life with calm confidence, whether surrounded by people or standing completely alone. Chapter 8. You become someone who cannot be easily shaken. The final shift does not feel like a new skill added to your life. It feels like a consolidation. All the previous changes quietly merge into something stable. You are not constantly managing yourself anymore. You are no longer correcting reactions, negotiating boundaries, or forcing discipline. Instead, you move through situations with a steadiness that feels natural. You become someone who is not easily shaken. This does not mean life stops testing you. Pressure still appears. Uncertainty still shows up. People still disappoint you. The difference is internal. These events no longer destabilize you the way they once did. They pass through you without rearranging your center. You feel them, but they do not define you. Before this shift, stability often depends on external conditions. When things go well, you feel calm. When things go wrong, you lose balance. Your inner state rises and falls with circumstances. Many people assume this is normal, even unavoidable. In reality, it is a sign that the center of gravity is outside of them. The books that produce this final shift gradually relocate that center inward. They do not do it by hardening you or making you indifferent. They do it by building internal structure. Responsibility gives you ownership. Emotional restraint gives you pause. Boundaries give you independence. Discipline gives you consistency. Solitude gives you self-trust. Together, these elements create inner stability. I noticed this shift during moments that once would have overwhelmed me. Situations that involved uncertainty, conflict, or high stakes no longer triggered panic. I did not feel fearless. I felt grounded. Even when outcomes were unclear, my response felt deliberate. I trusted myself to handle whatever followed. I saw the same pattern in people I respected deeply. They were not the loudest or most confident on the surface. They were steady. When others reacted emotionally, they remained composed. When plans changed suddenly, they adjusted without complaint. Their presence alone brought calm into chaotic situations. This is what it means to be unshakable, not rigid, not dominant, but stable enough that external forces do not control your internal state. You become adaptable without losing direction. Internally, this shift feels like simplicity. Fewer emotional swings, less rumination, more clarity about what matters and what does not. You stop carrying unnecessary weight. This lightness is not emptiness. It is efficient. You also become less reactive to outcomes. Success no longer inflates you. Failure no longer crushes you. Both are processed, learned from, and released. This emotional neutrality allows you to stay engaged without being consumed. For many listeners, this level of stability sounds distant or unrealistic. But it is built gradually, through absorption rather than effort. Each idea you truly live by removes a layer of internal noise. Over time, what remains is solid. This shift also changes how you show up for others. You stop trying to rescue, convince, or control. You listen without absorbing their stress. You support without losing yourself. This makes your presence more valuable, not less. People feel safer around someone who is not easily rattled. I remember a moment when someone close to me was spiraling emotionally. In the past, I would have been pulled into the intensity. This time, I stayed calm. I did not minimize their feelings. I did not amplify them either. My steadiness helped regulate the situation. That was new. This is the hidden benefit of inner stability. It extends beyond you. Calm is contagious when it is genuine. Others adjust unconsciously to your pace. Conflict de-escalates. Conversations slow down. Decisions become clearer. Books that support this shift often emphasize acceptance over resistance. They teach you to work with reality rather than fight it. Fighting reality drains energy. Accepting it allows you to act intelligently within it. This acceptance is not passive, it is strategic. As you absorb this lesson, you stop asking why things are happening and start asking what the situation requires. This practical orientation keeps you grounded. You're no longer emotionally invested in narratives. You're engaged with reality. Over time, your identity changes. You no longer see yourself as someone trying to improve constantly. You see yourself as someone who is stable, capable, and adaptable. Growth continues, but without desperation. This shift also affects your relationship with uncertainty. You stop needing guarantees to move forward. You trust your ability to respond. That trust is powerful. It frees you from paralysis. You act even when outcomes are unclear. For the listener, this is not about becoming invulnerable. Vulnerability still exists. Emotions still arise. What changes is your relationship to them. You do not collapse under them. You do not deny them. You move through them. When this final shift settles in, life feels quieter internally, even when the world remains loud. You are no longer bracing yourself constantly. You are present. This is the cumulative effect of absorbing the right books deeply. Not inspiration, not motivation. Stability. The kind of stability that does not depend on circumstances. The kind that stays with you in silence, in pressure, and in uncertainty. You do not announce this change. You do not need to. It shows up in how you move, speak, decide, and respond. You become someone who cannot be easily shaken, not because nothing affects you, but because nothing owns you. And that is the final transformation. When your mind reaches this state, it does not revert. You cannot unsee what you now understand. You cannot return to the chaos you once normalized. you have absorbed something permanent, something structural, something that quietly reshapes the rest of your life from this point forward. As this video comes to a close, it is worth pausing to recognize what has actually been explored here. This was never about books as objects, titles to collect, or ideas to admire from a distance. This was about what happens when certain ideas are absorbed deeply enough to change how you think, react, decide, and live. Across these chapters, one truth has remained constant. Transformation does not come from knowing more, but from becoming different. You saw how the first shift begins with responsibility, when you stop seeing yourself as a victim of circumstances and start reclaiming control over your internal state. From there, emotional reactions slow down, giving you space to choose instead of react. That space makes you harder to manipulate, because clarity replaces urgency. Your definition of success then changes, becoming quieter, more internal, and more aligned with who you actually are. Discipline stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like self-respect. Your words become fewer but heavier, because silence is no longer something you fear. Loneliness loses its grip as you learn to stand comfortably with yourself. And finally, all of these shifts combine into something solid, an inner stability that cannot be easily shaken. None of these changes happen overnight. They are not dramatic. They do not announce themselves. They appear gradually, through small adjustments in how you interpret moments and how you respond to pressure. That is why this kind of change lasts. It is structural, not emotional. What matters now is not how inspired you feel, but what you choose to practice. You do not need to apply everything at once. In fact, trying to do so would miss the point. Choose one idea from this video that challenged you, one shift that felt uncomfortable or unfamiliar. Sit with it. Observe how it applies to your daily reactions, your conversations, your decisions. Let it shape how you respond over time. That is how absorption works. You do not need perfect discipline or constant motivation to begin. You only need consistency and honesty. Real change happens quietly, through repetition, not intensity. If you live with even one of these principles long enough, you will notice that your old patterns no longer fit. And once that happens, there is no going back to who you were before. If you have listened this far, it tells me something important about you. It tells me you are not just looking for quick answers. You are looking for stability, clarity, and strength that lasts. That kind of work is not always visible, but it is always meaningful. Thank you for spending this time here, for listening with intention, and for being open to ideas that ask something of you rather than simply comfort you. If this video resonated, take a moment to share it with a friend you know is struggling, searching, or quietly trying to become stronger. Sometimes one perspective, at the right moment, can change the direction of someone's life. I appreciate you being here, and I look forward to continuing this journey with you in the next video.